Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Clark, the Operations Coordinator with the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We're going to get started in just a few moments, but if you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box for everyone, there is also a link to a copy of the presentation as well as closed captioning instructions in the chat box. And we'll be back in a few moments.
I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the first session of our 6th annual Prevention Summit. So we're up to number 6, my how time flies. We are so pleased to be able to bring you the quality programming and presenters that we have lined up for you for the next few weeks, starting with this presentation by Russ Irvin Funk, who has been our main consultant this year on all things related to mobilizing men to address issues of gender justice and gender equity. We're more on that later. I'll introduce Russ to you in just a moment, but I want to turn it over to Jennifer Clark from NISCATIV, who will go over the logistics for today's webinar so we all understand the parameters that we're operating in for participation. Jennifer?
Thank you, Lorian. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Clark, the Operations Coordinator with the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So a few housekeeping items for today. We are going to have all phone lines muted throughout the presentation, so we do ask that you use the chat box to post any questions that come up during the presentation, and we will be taking some breaks to answer those questions as well as a Q&A period at the end. We are recording this webinar, and a link to the recording as well as materials will be sent along to you in the next few days. There is a link to the presentation in the chat box if you would like to see that. We are also offering live captioning for today's webinar, which can be pulled up on your screen by hitting that CC button on the bottom. There's also some instructions in the chat, but please let me know if you need any assistance. And I'm going to hand it back to Lorian.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for all that you do and all that you did to help coordinate the summit. It's much appreciated, really. So I just want to say just a few words about the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence and who we are, and a little bit of a background about how we got to be here today with putting this presentation in front of you. So the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence is a statewide membership organization. So for anyone who's not a domestic violence program or a member organization or a state partner or ally that we work with all the time, being a member organization means that we take great pride in being member informed. So much of what we do is in response to requests that we get from the domestic violence programs all throughout the state. The New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence was founded in 1978, and we are dedicated to addressing and ultimately eradicating domestic violence. We are designated by the federal office, the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, to be the organization in the state of New York who will provide support and training and technical assistance to all of the domestic violence organizations throughout New York State, including being a clearinghouse for information and best practices for how best to serve survivors and their children, but also how to be addressing domestic violence in our communities. We believe that peace begins at home. We believe that our mission to end domestic violence involves addressing all forms of oppression and to address the root causes that allow this kind of violence and injustice to thrive. So that is who we are. We also convene many task forces and advisories that are at the regional level or the state level. And one of my great pleasures is convening a statewide prevention consortium. That consortium is comprised of prevention experts who are doing this work on the ground, as well as our state partners and allies who have either a regional or a statewide influence on prevention strategies and best practice around domestic violence. So, and people on that consortium are our stakeholders who help to advise a statewide prevention plan. That prevention plan is woefully overdue for an update. So we are currently updating our goals and our outcomes and really our theory of change around what will stop this violence from happening in the first place. Last year, under a wonderful facilitated conversation by Russ, that consortium, and I see many of you who've worked with us over the years who on that consortium are with us today. That consortium resoundingly supported lifting up this notion of engaging men and boys and taking a critical look at the strategies that are working in our state, across the country, and across the globe to help inform that updated state prevention plan. So we are starting our prevention summit this year by having Russ present on a state of the field report that he authored that looks at engaging men efforts in both the United States and Canada. And so that's what he'll be talking about today. So it will sort of unfold and start to make sense as Russ gets into his presentation and as he talks about that report's findings. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Russ. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and talk about who you are and what brings you to this work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lorianne. Thank you, Jennifer, for all of your work in making this happen. I'm really, really thrilled to be here again with you all. I've been with New York several times over the years and really happy to be here with you all today. And very excited to share with you the State of the Field report, which I'll get to in a moment. So just really briefly a bit about me. I'm based in Kentucky. In this virtual world, I have to apologize on the front end. My son is in the background working, finishing up his school day, and we have some unexpected housework that is happening around us. Hopefully they'll be quiet enough to not interrupt us, but you know, life in the virtual world, as they say. I have been privileged to be in this work for 30 something years at this point. I've been in Kentucky for the past 20, doing work primarily at the intersections of anti-racism and anti-sexism, and specifically focusing on engaging white men into this work, in these efforts. And as Lorianne said, I've been working with the New York State Coalition on developing some of the specific engagement tools and engagement efforts that you all are rolling out, and I'm very excited about what we've been able to put together. I will say that this week, also part of what's going on is the Global Men Engage Symposium. It started on Tuesday, and that is our kind of opportunity to connect with other male engagement practitioners and activists from around the world on some of the conversations and the leading efforts that are going on right now around this work and what we're doing. And I was in a part of a wonderful conversation this morning, kind of that has me primed even more for today's conversation. So with that, let me just jump right into the presentation. The State of the Field report was developed by NAMEN, which is the North American Men Engaged Network. NAMEN is a regional network made up of organizations and activists in Canada and the United States. And we are a member. We are this region's member to the Global Men Engaged Alliance. As a network organization, we are different than other kinds of organizations in that we don't do any kind of programmatic work in the field, as it were, because that puts us in a position to compete with our members, right? So we are, as a membership organization, as a membership network, our job is to highlight the work of some of our members and what they are doing. And then if there are gaps in that work, that's where we slide in and we work on developing those kinds of efforts, either by what NAMEN does or by working with some of our partners and making sure those gaps are filled in terms of what needs to be done regarding effectively engaging and mobilizing men in this sector. One of the areas that we found that there is a significant gap is that lane of policy advocacy, specifically in the US. In spite of the fact of having some very significant organizations in this country who are doing work around engaging and mobilizing men, we looked around and noticed that none of them are involved in Washington, D.C. at the policy level, either in terms of administrative policy or legislative policy. And that's an area that we have become very active in the past couple of years. The State of the Field report is looking at, as a project that we launched last spring with support from the Global Men Engaged Alliance and the Global Secretariat, but the funding was not great. So there's some limitations, which I'll talk about in a minute, about this State of the Field report. But it was not our chance to kind of do an initial scan from the 10,000 foot level, as Lorianne likes to say, of who's doing what and what are we learning, what are the trends that are emerging from this work. Today is the first part of a two-part series of conversations we're going to be having as part of the Prevention Summit with you all. Today is basically an overview around what we did with the State of the Field and what are some of the main learnings that we got from this. And then on Tuesday, we will be having a conversation with some practitioners from New York, which I hope many of you will come back for, because that's really where we're going to be looking at the report and what are the implications for New York. The panelists have a copy of the report. They have been reviewing it over the past days, and really be focusing on what is the report. To what degree does the report reflect New York's experience? And then, as I said, what are the implications for moving forward in terms of the prevention planning in the state? So in terms of the State of the Field report, the main idea was to kind of review the current efforts that are going on. One of the things that we noted is that in spite of the fact that there have been active efforts at least in the US for over 30 years, a little less so in Canada, this is the first scan of this kind that's ever been done, particularly in the United States and certainly in both countries, excuse me. And what we looked at was the efforts to engage and mobilize men that are community-based, campus-based, those efforts at the state and territorial or provincial levels, and the efforts on nationally in both Canada and the United States. The strategy or the methodology was what we call a desk review. What we mean by desk review is that it was methodology that I could do by sitting at my desk. So it started with doing a scan of what information is available online, who's got websites up, who's got information available that is fairly easily accessible for us to take a look at and answer some of the key questions around who's doing what in this work, what populations are you all working with, what geographic level, what area are you all working in, those kinds of questions. We followed that up with interviews with some key contacts. There are a number of particularly grassroots efforts that aren't to the point of even having a website yet. And so we were able to kind of contact some of them and find out what they were doing based on one-on-one interviews, one-on-one conversations. We also followed up for more in-depth interviews and information from what we could glean from the websites. One of the things that we found is that there's the variance about the information that's available on the websites is all over the map. There's some websites that you can get a lot of information from. There's a bunch that you can get very little. In addition to those sources of information, we also looked at the relevant practice literature. The Canada has been much more engaged in this work in a much more methodological and rigorous way in terms of taking a look at what's happening and developing a plan than the US is. And so the Canada actually has some very fascinating, very powerful countrywide reports that we were able to look at. And then we also looked at some of the other practice theory and literature that has come from, particularly from the global South, but from other countries and the world around engaging in work. And then lastly, there are a few reports that are relevant from the US. Income Stop Rate, for example, in 2016, I believe, 2015 or 16, released a report through Office on Violence Against Women on a small sample of college efforts on engaging men. And so as a part of our report, we added some of that information that we had, as well as some of the conversations that we had with campus efforts to engage men and boys. So some of what we were looking at in our review was, like I said earlier, what's the location and setting of engaging men efforts? What's kind of the geography, both in terms of where are folks doing the work? Where are organizations engaged in the work? Is it more of an urban setting? Is it more of a country setting? Is it more of a suburban setting? As well as mapping them out across the country. And our intention is, early in 2021, actually creating a physical map where we can locate the male engagement efforts that we can find. And then those of you who might be interested can take a look go to the NAMIN website and find where's a male engagement effort going on that's near you. We also want to look at what are the primary populations that current male engagement efforts are focused on in terms of their efforts. We wanted to look at the approach that organizations and practitioners are using in their efforts to engage and mobilize men, both theoretical approach, if they have a theory of change, if they have a theory that underlines the work that they're doing, as well as some of the practice premises that are the foundation for the works that they're doing. Big question that we had is what can we glean about the trends that are emerging from the work that's happening in this region? And we'll get to that later. There's some really rich, I'm excited to share that with you actually. There's some really rich information that's happening. As a part of the key trends, we also wanted to capture to the best that we can what are some of the lessons that we're learning in the process of doing this work. One of the things that I will kind of give you a sneak preview. One of the things that we have learned is that there isn't a lot of, the funding is, as you all know, the funding is limited for efforts to engage and mobilize men and boys. And very little of that funding provides time or space for practitioners or organizations to take a look at what they're learning in the process of doing it. As is the case with most funders, you all are in the nonprofit world by and large, you get this. It isn't about what are you learning, it's about what are you doing, and really doubling down on making, what are your outcomes, how are you achieving your objectives, are you making progress? And so as a field, we don't have a lot of chance to take a look at what are the lessons that we're learning in the process of doing this work. We wanted to take a moment and encourage the field to notice that. And so we captured some of that in this report. And then the last question we had is, what are some of the desires of engaging men efforts? What do folks on the ground who are doing this work, what would make this work easier? What would make this work better for them? What do they want in order to be able to do the work in the way that they want to be able to do the work? And all of that was kind of captured in this thing. So the current process that we are engaged in is we've written up the report. What we are in the process now is we have sent this report to about 27 or 28 national level organizations and practitioners in both Canada and the US, and asked them to take off the gloves, don't be gentle, don't be kind, be critical, be harsh around the report, and what did we miss in terms of attempting to do this scan? What are some questions that we needed to ask that we forgot to or didn't pay attention to? In terms of our evaluation of the data, we probably missed some stuff. What do you think that we missed? We're collecting that information, and then we're also going to be engaging some of the feedback hopefully we get from you all that's also going to inform the report before we actually release it. So this is still very much an emergent engagement process. Some of the limitations I want to kind of acknowledge on the front end about what we were not able to cover in terms of this report, in terms of our review of the state of the field. We were not able to capture engagement efforts in other arenas. Our focus right now, based to Lorianne's point earlier, we are, as a member network, we are really driven by the members of NAMIN. And while we do have a significant number of our members who are also engaged in the arena of reproductive sexual health and rights, all of our members are currently involved in preventing gender-based violence. That being said, there are significant efforts in both countries, particularly in Canada, on engaging men and boys in working to advance reproductive and sexual health and rights. We did not capture that in this report. Neither did we capture the work on responsible fatherhood efforts. And we did not look at the efforts to engage men in men's health. We were not able to capture some of the information around engaging men efforts on the military bases and in military installations. And we weren't able to connect with the engagement the efforts to any significant degree, the efforts to engagement of faith. And lastly, while we were able to touch base with campus-based efforts for engaging men, we were able to actually collect a fair amount of information from them. It wasn't nearly as comprehensive as the review that we were able to do with community-based organizations or statewide networks. What we found is that, as I said, this was started with a desk review looking at what's available on the website. If you go to college campuses and to try and find where is their male engagement effort, some of them have them up front and center and very visible. On other campus websites, it's buried somewhere underneath 3 or 4 layers of organizations or sub-organizations within the campus hierarchy. The other thing we found, which I think is somewhat telling, is that there is not, even though OVW has been paying for campus grants for at least 10 years, there's not an easily accessible database of what campuses have received the funding, what campuses are receiving the funding right now. Those campuses that have been funded and have lost the funding, are they still continuing their male engagement efforts? There doesn't appear to be any kind of methodological way of holding that and collecting that information so we know what's going on campuses. We were able to obtain some, but not nearly as much as we would like to. All right, I think with that, we're ready to tap into the content. So in terms of the mapping and what's happening where, what we found is that in the US, the male engagement efforts are spread across wide swaths of the country. There's a tendency appears to be that there are much more male engagement efforts kind of along the coasts. The middle part of the country, like I'm in Kentucky, the middle part of the country, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, there isn't as much happening. In the US, there are also a handful of statewide efforts. Ohio Men's Action Network, Idaho, Nebraska is emerging, Alaska has a statewide effort, Rhode Island, has a statewide effort, but by and large, those are the exceptions, not the rules. And those statewide efforts of kind of mobilizing and coordinating the efforts within those states. Canada appears to have a much more diverse and widespread male engagement network. It's not formally a network, they're not connected with each other, but there appears to be many more community-based grassroots kinds of male engagement efforts going on across Canada than it's what's happening in the United States. As a side note, I suspect that is in part due to the different positioning and the different governmental place that Canada is in versus the United States. And this predates our current administration, current outgoing administration. Canada actually has a national prevention plan for preventing gender-based violence. And within that plan, they actually have a plan for engaging and mobilizing men that has been approved and is funded by their federal government. The United States does not have a national plan for the prevention of gender-based violence. And that's really the only place that a national strategy for engaging men exists. Having a national plan for engaging men that is just that is probably extremely problematic if it's not located and housed within some other kind of effort. But the fact that Canada has that provides more support and more meaningful connection, even without funding, but more meaningful opportunities for men to be engaged than is the case in the United States. Canada also has their national tragedy from Montreal in 1989 that continues to be a national day of mourning, December 6th, in which the country continues to pay attention to the fact that that gender-based violence, gender-based murder is an extreme possibility and ongoing occurrence within Canada. And so they have a national yearly moment to pay attention to these issues and these dynamics. The United States does not have anything like that attention to a particular event, or does not involve itself in a lot of the global efforts around paying attention to violence against women and girls, gender-based violence, or the role of prevention. Most of the efforts that we found in the United States and in Canada are community-based. Largely, that means they work within a community. There are some that work within agencies that serve multiple communities, and they engage their male engagement efforts across those communities. But by and large, what we found in this scan is that most male engagement efforts are very singular focused. We also found that by and large, there aren't many efforts in the United States that can be identified as culturally specific. We'll come back to that later, I hope. And almost none that are intentionally multicultural or intersectional. There is some efforts that are working to more meaningfully engage an intersectional analysis and an intersectional approach in their efforts to engage men and boys, but very few work with men intentionally across multiple cultures or multiple cultural ethnic groups. Some of the patterns that we have learned, that we noticed, and this is going to be several slides of patterns, so bear with me. The first is that male engagement is a concept that is not, there's no universal way that we operationalize what the hell that means. For some folks, male engagement means they run a 1-week or 12-week education program for men and boys about gender-based violence and what men and boys can do. For other organizations and other efforts, male engagements means men are actually participating in doing something around promoting gender-based violence or responding to gender-based violence, as opposed to kind of the passive being educated model. In some cases, engaging men means efforts that are actually mobilizing men to take action in particular ways, either individually or as groups. I distinguish mobilizing between organizing as two different strategies, two different efforts. And there's some male engagement organizations and efforts that are actually organizing men within their communities, none at the state level yet, organizing men in their communities to take meaningful action to address gender-based violence. And then there's the whole social media and social messaging component that some organizations and efforts that are engaged with. These are not mutually exclusive, and I don't mean to list them out in a way that suggests that they are. There are some male engagement efforts that are involving in multiple of these. But the fact that we seem to have some confusion around what do we mean by male engagement is something for us to continue to play with and unpack, and hopefully come to some clarity with. Because in my mind, it seems to me that engaging men in a conversation where they listen well, where we listen well, pardon me, as if I'm not a man, engaging men in a conversation around what is gender-based violence, why is this a men's issue, why men need to be involved, is significantly different than engaging men around what they can do to actually tackle meaningfully the problem of gender-based violence. Some of the other patterns that we have learned is based on the scan is that efforts tend to be most effective and most sustainable when they are built within broad-based community or campus support. What I mean by that is, as opposed to offering a program that we get funding for and offering to the community in a way where the community is, if you will, the client that we're providing the service to, efforts that actually do the work of engaging the community and supporting the work tend to be more effective in terms of the outcomes and are more sustainable about long-term approaches and long-term work. Another pattern is similar to one that I mentioned earlier, but most engagement efforts focus on one population only. And in this area, I'm thinking particularly of age range. There are almost no multi-generational or male engagement efforts going on. Those that do exist that we were able to find only exist in Canada. And what I mean by that is that there seems to be some real value in considering how do we organize male children, adolescent men, young adult men, and older adult men in the same campaign so that they are working with each other intergenerationally to support the work and support the progress. Another way to think about it is how do we develop our efforts at the community level that starts with boys at elementary or middle school. It starts the work of getting them engaged, getting them mobilized, getting them generated, and then has strategically efforts at the high school level or with adolescent men, and then efforts at the college level or with younger adult men, and then ongoing efforts beyond that as men move into the community so that they don't get engaged at one stage and then there's nothing at their next stage of development for them to continue the engagement. Right now in the US, what we appear to have is focused efforts on a particular age range, right now mostly adolescent youth. And good luck with that. So we have a lot of programs, for example, with adolescent men at the high school level with high school athletes, and then they graduate from high school and they go to a college where there may or may not be any kind of engagement men effort. And there's very little, almost no coordination between efforts that are working at the high school level and efforts that are working at the campus level. The end result is that there's almost no opportunity for men to continue to develop their work, develop their level of engagement, develop their level, expand their level of mobilization as they grow, and mature. Obviously, at least in my mind, obviously, that has significant inhibitions for the growth of our movement. There's an overwhelming focus in both of our countries in working with adolescent and young adult men. By that, I mean college age men. There's a few efforts that we found in looking at the tween men or middle school age boys, and almost none. I found 2 in the United States that work with even younger boys. And likewise, there are extremely limited opportunity or efforts that focus on adult men in terms of engaging and mobilizing activities. And again, I think the implications are severe in terms of thinking about the long-term strength of our movement. One of the challenges that I think we need to continue that one of the patterns that emerged is that almost all of our efforts in both the United States and Canada, and this is in fact global, almost all of the engagement efforts are focused on the individual level. And how do we engage individual men to be more active and involved? And we are doing almost nothing at the structural level to change the structure and the institutions in which men and boys are active. I used this example earlier today, the situation we have is that we have coaching boys into men, or coach for men, or coaching for change, or any of a number of coaching efforts to work with coaches or athletes or teams. And so we do a bystander intervention program with these adolescent boys in a high school around what they can do to be activists, but aren't necessarily doing anything with the school itself and the school environment. And so what it sets these boys up to do is that they are empowered to do something, to say something, do something when the situation arises. but they're in an environment where it's a crapshoot as to whether that environment actually supports gender equality or gender justice, or supports boys to actually be engaged in doing what we're asking boys to be engaged to do. And one of the things we know really clearly around whether this is a bystander approach or an allying approach, I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the things we know very clearly is that if I am attempting to be a bystander and my scan of the environment, it says that this is dangerous, perceived or real, then I'm not going to engage in the bystander activities that you've invited me to do. Yet as a movement, we are doing almost nothing to create environments that are safe for boys to be allies the way we're asking boys to be allies. Obviously, there's a significant issue for us in terms of growing this movement. And really glaringly, another pattern that emerged is that we have almost no agreed or shared operating standards or principles about how do we actually engage men and boys in this work. And without standards, as you all know, without some clear standards or principles, then you're kind of left following your nose in terms of what we're doing. And one of the challenges of doing this work in particular is that there are very real dangers that working to engage men and boys, if it's not done with some care around the principles and standards of how we're doing it, the work of engaging men and boys can actually make things worse for women and girls, not better. Got one more slide and then we're going to take a pause for questions and comments, so please bear with me. The last kind of group of patterns that we found is that the vast majority of male engagement efforts in the US and Canada are still very, very isolated. It is not at all uncommon for a male engagement practitioner to be the only practitioner in his agency or her agency. Frequently, they're a part-time staff person. And so they work at a rape crisis center or a domestic violence agency, and their position is prevention coordinator or prevention educator or community educator, and some portion of their work is engaging men. And they work in a crisis center. And so you all know as well as I do that when you work at a crisis center, whatever your job may be, depending on what's going on, you're likely to be pulled into answering the hotline or doing the crisis response. It's no different for the male engagement folks that we learned. So that isolation is both on the individual level, that they're likely the only one in their agency, and at the organizational level, that in many of in our scan, there are a lot of states that have one engaging men effort in the entire state. And that sense of isolation is problematic, as you all well know. We don't have an agreed upon, not only do we have no agreement on principles or standards of how we do this work, we don't have any meaningful operationalized way of defining what are accountable practices of engaging men and boys. We also have learned that there is the availability of a statewide network, like what Ohio has, like what Rhode Island has, is extremely powerful in sustaining and encouraging the work, not only of the individual men who we're seeking to get engaged, but the community-based efforts. We have to figure out a different strategy for sustaining the funding for these efforts. By and large, the male engagement funding is limited to, in some cases, 3 to 4 years, and then the funding dries up. And we need to do a lot more work, both in terms of developing the skills of our male engagement practitioners on fundraising and how do you create some sustainable funding, but also some work with the funders around the need to fund efforts for a long enough chunk of time to where they can get engagement from the community to support the work. And the last pattern that I want to touch on is the existence of the silos that exist in our work. We got a bunch, and they are comprehensive and complex. And I'm going to take a moment for questions and comments, and then we'll come back and unpack the silos question here in a minute. So questions, comments, criticisms, and you're going to see me duck my head as I take notes. That's explaining my ducking my head.
It would be obvious if we were sitting around a table, right? Or in the room together, that's what you were doing. So we do have a question. Hi, Russ, can you define community? And it's a term you've used quite a bit already in this presentation. Are you talking about geography or demographics?
Great question. Thank you. I am talking, at this point, I'm talking primarily geographic. So, looking at asking a male engagement program or initiative, what's the geographic reach of your organization, of your effort? Are there other questions or comments that we've got yet?
That is the only one so far. Let's give it a couple of Zoom seconds, which always feel longer than seconds, and
Yes,
see
indeed.
if anybody has any questions or comments. Anything resonating for you from the report findings that Russ has presented so far? Charles, thank you. Yes, it is hard work. Thank you for commenting. It is hard work. And, some of us have been at it for, more than a decade. And Russ, what I appreciate is how you talked about, there's limitations to what we know works, to what's been working. There's also great value in doing this work. And the limitations have to do with exactly what you said, that domestic violence exists, the reasons for domestic violence exist, and sexual violence too. It's structural, much like racism is structural. And so if all of our strategies around addressing it have to do with only engaging the individual and not at the community level, however we define community, then we're missing the boat. So I really appreciate that you said that it can't be solved by engaging individuals alone. There have to be, multiple strategies at multiple levels, how we are in relationships, how we're raising our children of, all genders and gender identities. So, all of that is a piece of it. And so it complicates the issue quite a bit. No other questions? There are a couple questions. Go ahead.
Okay. I just kind of tying that back. I think one of the things that makes it so hard is because so many of us are isolated. One of the things that I heard loud and clear from male engagement practitioners who have been doing this for a minute is that they're looking, we don't have a way, if you think about male engagement work kind of from the professional development model, and I don't want to totally buy into that, but bear with me for a minute. Most of us, as we move into a profession, there's ways for professional advancement, not necessarily in terms of hiring or my position, but in terms of deepening my professional knowledge, right? When I was a therapist, there was a way for me to, as I came into the field, there was a way for me to kind of start working, but then I got that. And there was places for me to go to get deeper and more knowledge and more understanding and more practice theory around how do I do the work, in my case of working with boys who've been sexually victimized. We don't have that in this region. There isn't a way for someone to come into the field new and fresh and understand male engagement. And then what's the male engagement 201 or 401 or the graduate level male engagement course or initiative that they can be involved in? If you're doing the same thing every day, all the time, getting the same results, that's exhausting. We need an opportunity to kind of stretch our thinking and stretch ourselves and move out of the bubble that we've created. That's part of what is it. That's one of the responses to this fatigue that is this work that's just an ongoing, that feels so relentless. And so that's one of the things that as a field we need to develop, and perhaps that's true in New York as well. I'm not going to speak for New York. This scan was not specific to New York. This was, 2 countries. But perhaps one of the things that can emerge out of this for New York is the degree to which within New York, you can do that developmental work with your male engagement activists to help them continue to develop their energy and their momentum and their excitement about doing this work.
Exactly. In some ways, it's almost more important to understand community organizing 101 or what mobilizing a community to really engage. in sort of social justice issues. You know, those are the skills that preventionists really need. We talk about this all the time when we're hiring people to do prevention projects, prevention initiatives, training out in the world, in schools, in the workplace, in the community, you know, whatever the setting might be. You know, what are the skills to really be able to engage any community? And so and that's a piece of the conversation. Russ, there are there's a comment and a question. Before, do we have time to do that before you move on?
Please, yes.
So from Jean Nordzi, and Jean, if you put it to all panelists and everyone, so I hope that my assumption that you want us to share this is accurate. And Jean is a long time, one of the very first communities to be engaging and mobilizing men in Warren and Washington County with Northern New York Call to Men. So very seasoned in this work. It feels very significant to hear this 30,000-foot view. It's very important to notice parts of structure that aren't yet there, to name them in order to pave the way to create them. So I feel hopeful, and I appreciate the discerning mind of you and your colleagues to in fact notice and name those pieces of infrastructure that are not yet there and needed. When people don't know what's missing, they might not miss it. But when it's pointed out, can we move towards it locally, nationally, internationally? Thank you. So that's just wonderful. Thank you, Jean, for that comment.
Thank you, Jean. Yes.
And then we have a really good question. And so from Epiphany, how would you recommend to engage the school/community to support the work that these male groups are doing? There's absolutely a disconnect between what we are doing to engage males and the environment that they are in. And so there's a couple things, and Russ, I do want to punt that to you, but one thing that I want to say is, you know, this is not a slam dunk sort of there's one way to do things, and, you know, it's tried and true in terms of answering your question. I think I'm hoping that you can join us, first of all, next Tuesday, when we're going to have several panelists who are doing this work locally, who will have some ideas about what they're doing locally. It really has to be resonant and relevant for the local community. And I think that that's what makes it so challenging, that there's just not one. Russ, you talk about being evidence-based. There's really not one evidence-based program that works. There's a lot of principles. There's a lot of guidelines for doing it. So I hope you can come back on Tuesday, and then we'll also be having a conversation around supporting prevention educators who are struggling right now to do this kind of organizing in schools and in communities during COVID. You know, schools are not letting us in to do programming. Community engagement is extremely challenging right now, if not stopped altogether. So please do come back. We'll make sure that you continue to get information around these conversations that will be ongoing, not just for the rest of the year, but into 2021 for sure. Right. And
Right.
Russ, please go ahead.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
How would you recommend to engage the school/community to support the work that these male groups are doing? There's absolutely a disconnect between what we are doing to engage males and the environments that they're in.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So I think my fallback is always looking at what's the benefit for that community. So if I'm working with a school, as an example, their job is to get kids through their school process, right? Their job is to educate. So how can I align my goals with theirs? I'm not asking them to align their goals with me. I'm thinking to myself, okay, how does this male engagement initiative help them improve their scores? Help them improve parent participation in the school. Help them improve in their level of male or student engagement in the school beyond academic performance. And that is what I found as most helpful in terms of getting the community, in this case, the schools, to buy in. If it meets their goals without asking too much of a reach, then they seem more willing to buy into it. As a quick example, without getting too off focus, one of the programs we have going that we've launched here in Kentucky is called the Healthy Boys Project. And it's targeting, wrong word, It is focused on elementary age boys. But the program is not for the boys. The program is for the school and for the teachers. And what we go in is starting with talking with them around most schools, most teachers, without thinking about it, have a certain, and I'm in Kentucky, so that may be different in New York, but in Kentucky, there's a very finite idea of how boys show up in the school. And boyhood is privilege over girlhood. And so we engage in this 2-day conversation to talk with them around, just pay attention to the fact that this exists. Quick example that we do in 2nd grade in University in Kentucky, they have a fairy tale program where the kids read fairy tales, and then in groups, they get to write their own fairy tale. I'm probably asking the wrong audience, but one of the activities that we engaged with these teachers and schools in is, tell me of a fairy tale in which boys get to get rescued by girls. Now, we all know that a part of the human experience is there are times and moments when I'm the rescuer, but there's times and moments when I get to be rescued as well. That is being a rescuer and rescued. That's a human experience, not male or female. And yet our fairy tales, particularly the traditional ones, which they're reading to our children in Kentucky, they're very gendered around who gets to be the rescuer and who gets to be the rescued. And so what does that mean in terms of, and then the next question we ask is, so when you all think about the kind of boy that needs to be rescued, what happens in your body? And most folks go, ew, both in terms of noticing what goes on in their bodies when they think about the boy who gets rescued, but also in terms of that ooh, thinking about, ooh, that boy, there's something soft, there's something wrong, there's something problematic about a boy who gets rescued. We're talking about 2nd graders here, roughly 7 years old, right? But already this mindset that we have, and it's not about anybody's problem, it's just so ingrained, it's in our bones, right? What we found is by talking with schools around, if you can address this, guess what that means in terms of engaging the boys that are in your classroom actually in learning? It goes up. Guess what that means if you can engage the boys differently and you make femininity not something that's problematic? Then you engage the girls differently, and your girl engagement goes up, their grades go up, your performance goes up, people are happy. Your parents are happy, your administrators are happy, your funding goes up. This is a win-win. That was a very long-winded answer to your question about how to engage the community, but I encourage you to think about that notion of how can you make the idea of engaging men a benefit for that sector that you're trying to get to buy in. And then do we have another question or two?
We do. We've got some great questions. So we have a great question about does the work also include working with women as well? It's like working on racism and Black people as the Negro problem, rather than engaging white people and white supremacy. The work must be done in a context of educating women as well. And so I've sort of said, well, women can be very educated about this and still end up being with someone who controls and hurts them. The context is sort of educating and stopping perpetration. That's what primary prevention is, stopping first-time perpetration and really sort of engaging the people who are most likely to perpetrate, not getting girls and women to stop perpetration against them, or training them to not become victims. That's, we've been doing that for 30 years. That doesn't work, right? So all that education and all that assertiveness, whatever that is, very accomplished women, very well-educated women still end up being abused by their partners. So the way we see it is, yes, of course, everyone should be educated about what healthy relationship behaviors are. Not just what teen dating violence or dating violence looks like, so that people can recognize the red flags, because we know that the red flags don't always exist from the beginning. People, perpetrate once you're sort of invested in that. Invested in the relationship. So Charles, it's such a good question, and it gives us a chance to kind of talk a little bit about, so why engage men? Why this gendered analysis around, around what we're doing? So I'll stop now and let Russ fill the rest.
Well, it's interesting because I heard the question as something very different. which was around engaging men to engage, or educating or engaging women to engage men. And so I don't know how whoever asked the question, I'm not sure what you meant, but I think it's important to acknowledge and point out that there are way more women involved in efforts to engage men and boys and mobilize men and boys than there are men involved in working to empower women and girls. And this field is predominantly women, including the work to engage men and boys. And so I think women are already largely educated.
Yeah, so Russ, I just want to just interject. So the question is sort of around pathology. How are we sort of addressing pathology? So of course, I felt compelled to say, well, we don't really see it as pathology. We see it as a social norm that is accepted and tolerated. But Charles asked a great follow-up question. So what then is the role for women in ameliorating this problem? So Russ, I know you could speak to that. That's a great question. And well, you just did. Women have been,
women are, and I think someone else made the parallel of racism. It's as a white person, it's not my job to think about or figure out what is Black people's role or brown people's role in ameliorating racism. I got my hands full in thinking about what white people can do. I got my hands full thinking about how do I raise a son who's white in this world to push back against racism. I find the parallel to be true. It's not, I don't know what women can do. I think women are figuring that out and are doing a damn good job. I know that I got my hands full in figuring out what is it that men can do and how can we improve and enhance the work that men are doing. I wanted to go ahead because I'm aware of time and aware of how much content I want to share with you all, and slide into the next content. I'm sure there's other questions, but we'll take another break in a few minutes. So there are a lot of silos that we've identified. The first one is that we have created these silos between engaging men to prevent gender-based violence, engaging men to respond to gender-based violence, and engaging men in terms of intervening with them for the violence that they've perpetrated. As if there's these three different categories of men. There are men who are ready to be our allies. There are men who have experienced gender-based violence in some way, and there are men who have perpetrated gender-based violence or sexism in some way. And we all know, thinking about, if we think this through, we know that that's a bunch of garbage, that most of us as men are all three, right? Most of us as men are positioned to some degree to be allies. Most of us as men have experienced some kinds of gender-based violence throughout of our lives. We've witnessed the violence of our mothers or our grandmothers or our sisters. We've witnessed sexual assaults and rapes. We've witnessed other men sexually harassing or exploiting women, or other men. We've experienced bullying either by being victimized or by watching it around us. And most of us has perpetrated some form of gender-based violence in our lives, especially if we understand gender-based violence broadly, as I know NISCADIV and NISCASA, your partner organization, do. And yet we have these three very clearly siloed efforts to engage that could arguably be called engaging men. We also found that there's some significant silos between the kind of work that's done. There's efforts to engage men and boys in sexual assault and rape. There's efforts to engage men and boys in domestic and dating violence. And there's efforts to engage men and boys in sexual exploitation. There is some confluence between rape and sexual assault and dating and domestic violence in some cases. And sexual exploitation continues to be this this other category that is not well integrated into the work holistically. There are silos between engaging men and between gender-based violence work, sexual and reproductive health, and responsible fatherhood. There's almost no intersection between those areas of engaging in work. And there's silos between engaging in work on college campuses and engaging in work in the community. There are some cases that we found, as an example, where there's an engagement effort on a college campus, an engagement effort in the same town, and they're not aware of each other, or nor do they communicate. I don't mean that as a criticism of them. I mean that as a criticism of the funding streams and the structures that we put in place around how we do this work. That makes it really hard for us to build bridges across these artificial silos. As you all know, I assume, as I certainly believe, human beings were not meant to live in silos. Our programming was not meant to be effective in silos. And yet our funders, by and large, haven't caught up with that yet. And the structures that support our work, the structures within which our work exists, haven't caught up with that yet. So part of our effort is to notice the silos that exist and figure out some creative strategies around how do we maneuver through them. All right. Some of the trends that we've found in terms of the engagement work in the US and Canada. I'm not going to read these to you. You can see them. Most of this is focused on prevention. Prevention is very much influenced by the public health model of what prevention is. Heavy reliance on bystander theory and practice. I want to take a minute on this because I think this is critical. And there is a lot of value in bystander intervention. I don't want to take anything away from it. And there is a significant difference between bystander intervention theory and practice and allying theory and practice. There actually isn't much overlay between the two, although a number of programs confuse the two and talk about bystander intervention that moves into ally, like calling bystander work movement from bystanders to allies. They're very different approaches. They're very different models of the work. And I think it's important for us to drill down around those differences and make some strategic decisions for community-based efforts, campus-based efforts on their own, and in terms of our own kind of standards and practices around what are we really wanting to do. One of the big differences between the two is that bystander theory, by and large, doesn't take structural issues into context. Doesn't pay a lot of attention to structural issues of sexism, racism, how racism and sexism. Bystander intervention focuses on the problem as if the problem exists in individual behaviors that other individuals can intervene in. But gender-based violence is not the problem of individuals who perpetrate gender-based violence. The problem of gender-based violence is structural in an environment that allows, tolerates, and encourages human beings to hurt each other. And if we're spending all of our time at this level and aren't able to get up at the structural level and address the environment that allows, encourages, and tolerates this, then our ability to make the changes we're trying to make is only so going to go so far. As I mentioned earlier, there's limited practice at systemic or structural efforts. We really don't have good efforts to meaningfully, evaluate the work that we're doing. By and large, programs just aren't funded to do that and don't have the capacity or the skills to do that in any significant way. There's satisfaction surveys, by which I mean, the one-off survey methodology around, what did you learn from this experience? But there's no actual evaluation around what is the meaningful impact, behavioral impact, structural impact of this effort or that initiative. Although there's a lot of interest and a lot of talk about applying, particularly right now, particularly since the uprising of 2020, there's been a lot of talk around the need to really double down on implementing intersectional practice into our work of engaging men. There are very few practice models about how to actually do that. And there's also inconsistent integration of what's called the gender transformative practice in the work of engaging men and boys. One of the things that's emerged is, as I reported earlier, most of our work is focused on high school and college age men, and most of that focuses on athletes and fraternities. There are at least 6 in the United States. There are at least 6 major initiatives, pretty well-funded initiatives that focus on engaging athletes. Probably the most popular, most well-known is Coaching Boys and Men, but there's at least 5 others that we found in our scan. One of the questions that emerges is that I grew up in Texas, I live in Kentucky. Athletes in high school are a privileged group. Male athletes in high school are a privileged group. In my experience on colleges, fraternities are often a privileged group. So what does it mean? What does it mean for us as a movement if we focus our time and attention privileging the people who are already privileged? And what does that mean about who we're ignoring or missing because we're focusing so much time and energy on the already privileged? amongst the group of men and boys in our community. It's an important question, I think, for us to ask and look at. Then what does that mean about the other men and boys in our communities who aren't athletes or fraternity brothers, who can have meaningful, powerful leadership role in changing our cultural environments? We have a real reliance on evidence-based and peer-reviewed efforts. This backs up to both the inconsistency of intersectional practice and gender transformative practice, because there aren't intersectional practices that have been evidence or peer-reviewed. There haven't been, at least in the US, there haven't been gender transformative practices that have fit that model of evidence-based and peer-reviewed. One of the things that we've realized as doing this scan is that there's a real value. I don't want to criticize the peer review model. I think there's real value in that. What I'm concerned about is that the peers who are reviewing the models are not our peers. They're not practitioners doing the work of engaging men. They might be, maybe some of them might be practitioners who think about or who research or who study engaging men. But you all know there's a huge difference between academia and real life in terms of doing this work. The peers, by and large, who review our data are overwhelmingly white and are overwhelmingly privileged in other ways. So that leads us as NAMA to start considering, how can we democratize, how can we decolonize the peer review model? How can we set up situations where actually our peers are reviewing each other's work? I love the opportunities that I get for my peers to take a look at what I'm developing here in Kentucky and give me harsh, important, critical feedback. I may not want to hear it. I'm going to be honest. Sometimes I have a little bit too much ego attached to the programs that I develop. That may just be me. Some of y'all may be healthier than I am. But even though I don't like it, I do value it. So there's value to the peer review model. The problem is the current peer review model that we have isn't meeting our needs, because they ain't the peers that we need to have reviewing our work and what we're doing. The other aspect of this is that very few of community-based efforts have the time, the energy, or the talent to write articles for the journals, for the peer reviewer journals that would mean your practice models are getting peer reviewed, right? Who's got the time to write it? Who's got the time to write that kind of journal article? By and large, it's independent consultants and academics. But those of you who are on the ground doing the work, you aren't supported to write a 30-page journal article and submit it to the Journal on Violence Against Women. All right, and then some of the lessons, and then I'm going to take a break for some more questions and comments. I'm trying to pay attention to time as well. So some of the lessons that we've learned is that pretty universally, we all agree that we start with meeting men and boys where they are. But this isn't, we don't have a universal definition about what that actually means, to meet men and boys where they are. Some use this idea of meeting men and boys where they are to launch gender neutral approaches as efforts to get engagement in boys. Others use a gender transformative approach to engage men and boys. Others use an approach that can only be, that I would define, I can't say it's only to be defined, but that I would define as gender harmful, such as the Real Men Don't Rape type campaigns, which I've seen a lot on college campuses. The other critical question to consider is, yes, we start any kind of community organizing methodologies. You start where people are at. You start with them where they're at, but you don't keep them there. The idea is start with them where they're at and then move them and have a process for moving them to someplace. And we don't have clear methodologies or clear thinking around, and certainly not on the national level, around if we're starting with men with where they're at, what are we moving them to? How are we getting them there? One of the other challenges of meeting men and boys where they're at, and this I think is critical, is of our work, of our movement, is how do we focus our efforts on engaging men and boys without centering men and boys in this work? The goal is not engaging men and boys. The goal is advancing gender justice. Engaging men and boys is a strategy, but starting with where men and boys are at there's a very open invitation to then land that's our work, to figure out how do we meet men and boys where we're at, and forget that our goal is not to meet men and boys where they're at. Our goal is advancing gender justice. Our goal is advancing racial justice with our work with men and boys, and intersecting racial justice and gender justice, right? Our goal is much bigger than the men and boys in the room. And sometimes the men and boys in the room, if we meet them where they're at, they're promoting and advancing gender injustices, right? Even at the subtle level. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do and figure out, what does that actually mean for you all in New York? What does it actually mean when you say you start with men and boys with where they're at, and move them where, and move them how? And how does meeting men and boys where they're at advance your work towards gender justice in the state of New York? Other lessons that I want to touch on real quickly is this question of accountability, and what does it mean for us to engage in men and boys in ways that are accountable to feminist leadership, accountable to the men and boys themselves, accountable to the communities that we're involved in and we're engaged in. There's multiple accountabilities that we're maneuvering through and juggling. I would argue our first and primary is accountability to feminist victim advocates. But that's my argument. You all need to figure out what that means in terms of your work in New York. And then coming up with, and then we don't have, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a national operationalization of accountability and what that means. And I don't know whether New York does or not. It would be an interesting question to ask, whether you all have a statewide understanding of what it means to be accountable in this work. I'm aware of time, so I'm not going to spend much time on these last 2 points. I want to open it back up for questions and comments, because we've only got about 10 more minutes. How did that happen? So, Lorianne, can you bounce back on and share if there's any questions or comments at this point?
Yeah, so Charles and I are having like quite a nice dialogue there, and I don't want to belabor it too much, but you can see the back and forth that we've been going through in the Q&A, and really, really great questions about, we're all human. Why, what are we doing for women? How are we communicating, healthy relationships and all of that. And so I just, I want to land on just a principle around community organizing, which I put in my response. And Charles, I've invited you. I hope you can come back next Tuesday, and for the other conversations that we're going to be having in the next few months around engaging men. It's asking any group that is oppressed or victimized, marginalized, to be responsible for ending the oppression against them is sort of, the way I was taught community organizing was we don't do that, or dismantling oppression. We don't make Jews responsible for ending anti-Semitism. That's for non-Jews to do. We don't make people of color responsible for ending racism. That is the work of white folks. Like, we're really clear about that. So we don't make people who are, we don't make gay folks responsible for ending homophobia. That's the work of straight folks. So, the conversation around, what do we do to engage women is really, really interesting. And I hope you'll stay in the conversation with us so we can talk more about that. And then we have a great question from George, which has to do with, can you talk more about what this gender transformative approach is? Because that language is it's in all of the research around what works, particularly to engage young men. There's some research and emerging evidence that in order to do something gender transformative is around the middle school age. There's not a ton of evidence about what works and how it works, but that's where that's going. So Russ, yeah, the great question from George.
And that may be a whole nother conversation. But just real briefly, yeah, the gender transformative model actually came out of work in the Global South, of working around preventing HIV/AIDS. And the idea was to without getting too much into the weeds, the idea of gender transformative practice is to transform men's understanding of themselves as men and how they experience and express masculinity in a way that centers gender equality. Or to use our language now, gender justice. So what we've found is that men tend to have a very challenged and complex relationship with masculinity. I should say male type people should have tend to have a very nuanced and complex relationship with masculinity. There's both enormous privilege in that identity, but there's also enormous constraints. And we are not really good at being articulate. We as male type people are not really good and articulate around talking about the privilege and entitlement. We are even less articulate around the constraints, but we feel them. And in fact, we feel the constraints more readily than we experience the privilege. And those of us who understand our own experience of privilege knows that, that I don't experience my privilege because it's a privilege, right? I don't think about driving while white. I just do it. But driving while white is a privilege. And so the idea of gender transformative practice is to help men and boys understand that by transforming how they experience and express their humanity in a way that centers gender equality, not only enhances the work that they do, but enhances the lives that they live. And so that's where we kind of get into this notion of engaging men and boys. Meaningfully doing this is actually mutually beneficial. The challenge is that while it may benefit me in significant ways, I also lose privilege and entitlement, and losing privilege and entitlement feels like a loss. I don't know that I necessarily experience in the same material way the advances of my human rights, as opposed to the privilege that I know I'm losing. But the gender transformative model provides a framework of how to meaningfully engage men in this work. There's a lot more to it. There's actually kind of a 5-stage model of moving from gender neutral towards gender transformative in our approach, which I don't have time to go into, obviously, at this moment, but would love to talk with you more about what that is and what that might look like as a centering principle for your work in New York.
Thank you, Russ. And if you could share that, it's a handout, right? You've got that in a handout. We can share that with participants. There's a couple things that I would just want to mention. We have another comment from George that is great. We have, lots of good comments, but I want to acknowledge and maybe remind you that we're ending at 3:15 today.
So we're done.
And but here's what I'm going to offer. This is being recorded. For those of you who expected to be let go at 3:15 and you have to drop off, that's fine. We could stay on for another, 10 minutes, and Russ, you could sort of wrap up. The beauty of that is because we're recording it, any participant who had to hop off, you could see the last 10 minutes of the conversation, because we're going to send you a link to the recording. So Russ, I'm just checking in with you as the presenter.
That would work. I have more content that I wanted to share, but I think the dialogue is more important than the content. So
yeah, I mean, I was hoping that you could get, you could wrap up the content too, if that's something that you felt was really important. And it is, this is really common. There's always more to share.
Right.
And this has been really good, great information. So again, we meant to, we should have known better. We meant to have this be 75 minutes.
Right.
So if you have to hop off, we understand. You will get the link. You'll be able to revisit the last couple of minutes of our conversation. And if you can stay, please stay, and we'll close it down at 3:30.
Yes, and thank you. For those of you who do have to leave, thank you for your participation and involvement. And as Lorianne has said several times, hopefully we'll see you on Tuesday.
Yes. And do get in touch if you would like to be involved in conversations, but you're worried you're not part of a mailing list or an email or a listserv, and you want to make sure that you bring that to our attention. If you email Jennifer or myself, we can make sure you're part of those ongoing conversations. Russ, I do want you to deliver more content if you've got, I know you've got a few more slides, but I did want to say that George Kilpatrick did talk about one of the issues with the campus has to do with campus work, has to do with the campus narrowly defining what community is.
Yes.
And, so, George, earlier on, somebody asked Russ to define community. And so it can be geographic, it can be setting, it can be, it can be however you define community, as long as that, all of the people that you're working with are in consensus that that's what community is. But Russ, I wanted to just pose that comment to you and see if you had a response.
I think campus efforts are differently complex than community-based efforts, because campus-based efforts, so campuses are both a community and an organization. If you kind of think about organizational theory and practice and community organizing, campuses are both, and they're a business. So it's this odd mix. And so male engagement efforts on college campuses are to a large degree subject to how their college or their university defines community, defines the goals, defines the population, defines the audience. Campus-based efforts are differently able to self-define what it is that they're doing and who they're working with, right? A community-based effort can kind of figure that out for themselves and then go seek the funding. A campus-based effort is by and large subject to the definitions that are placed upon them by the campus or the university within which they're working. And so that makes the work, I think, much more differently complex and nuanced than those of us who are used to working in the community at the community level. Campuses are also very different in that they have an unsustainable population, right? Every 4 years, there's a whole new population in town that they have to start with. Whereas at the community-based level, hopefully I've got some sustainability of the men that I'm organizing that are going to be around for 4 years or 5 years or 10. And so that again makes the work that they're trying to do much more complex and nuanced. So those are my thoughts in terms of some of the differences between campus-based work and community-based work. All right. One of the clear desires that we've heard from male engagement efforts in both Canada and the United States is this desire to be an active part of a meaningful network, whether that's at the state level, the community level, provincial level, territory level, or nationally. Organizations and practitioners want to be connected. They're for the opportunity for resource sharing, for the opportunity for peer support, peer teaching and learning, to share some practice approaches. All of the items that are listed here. There's a real desire to be part of a network, to be part of a community. And again, no one's funded to network. You're funded to do the job. You're not funded to talk with the folks over in Topeka about what they're doing and what they're learning. So this is an area, and since that's the job of NAMIN, this is an area that we're really looking to double down on and figure out how do we create some meaningful networks and support the development of meaningful networks. Some of the additional questions that came up for us in doing this report is this first one, which I think is really critical. How do we engage men without centering men? How do we do this work in ways that don't focus or reinforce the gender binary? Lorian and Jennifer and I have had conversations for 6 months about this, around how, but the very idea of engaging men suggests that there is a thing of manhood that we're trying to work with. And that by definition means we seem in some ways to be reinforcing the gender binary that we know doesn't exist and doesn't benefit us. How do we share practice approaches? How do we work on skills development and practice development? how do we meaningfully engage in intersectional approaches? There's a real need, particularly under the current and previous administration, to engage in meaningful and effective policy advocacy. One of the things that became really clear with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act was the fact that there weren't any male organizational voices at the national level joining with the feminist voices to say we need to pass this damn bill. It was all left to the women. And A, there's a need for us to fill in that space. And B, there's a desire of male engagement practitioners to be differently engaged in policy advocacy. There's a challenge because there are funders that outright prohibit policy advocacy, and there's a confusion often between advocacy and lobbying that we need to unpack. And then there's this whole question of that a lot of male engagement practitioners have around responding to those quote unquote resistant men. I think there's some good methodologies around how to engage the men who are willing and interested in being engaged, but those men who are on the fence, those are men, and we're not talking here about the men who are outright hostile. We're not talking about how to address and respond to incels or, the men's rights folks. We're talking about those men who are more kind of on the fence or leaning away from the invitation to be engaged. There's some real questions around how do we effectively address and respond to them. And that is the end of my time, so I'm going to bump it back to Lorianne for any kind of closing comments that you may have.
Thank you very much. So thank you for sharing all of that, Russ. We did get one question that I answered in the Q&A, which had to do with, would participants get the report? And so I did, I hope this was correct to say it's not for public consumption yet. You've put it out for comment and critique. And once it is published, ready for sharing, that we will share it with all our relevant stakeholders here in New York.
Yes. The plan right now is for NAMA to release it in January.
Okay. Good.
We have some final critical feedback that we want to integrate, and then yes, we'll be sharing it widely in early part of 2021.
Wonderful. And then Jennifer, can you help me? Did I get everything from the chat and the Q&A, or did I miss anything?
No, Lauren, you got everything as far as I saw.
That's amazing. Yep. Okay, good. So Russ, I think you've invited people for Tuesday next week, which is a continuation. It's Tuesday 1 to 2:30, and we will have a variety of people speaking to all sorts of different ways to engage around this topic in their communities. As I said earlier, there'll be some queer focused conversation. Russ has helped us tremendously this year develop some tools around engaging dads, it's a campaign we're calling Because We're Dads. And, we want to make sure that that's really inclusive of all male caregivers and also male identified folks. And it's just one of those things that we're thinking about, how are we creating tools and resources and just a compilation of the best resources that are out there that will help people organize in their own communities. So not just to help people who are fathering or parenting, but also prevention educators and coordinators, like so many of you are on the line today. So that conversation will happen very naturally next week. We've asked everybody to also respond to the report, but as practitioners here in New York, talk a little bit about what's happening in their communities right now and the successes and the challenges that they're seeing. So I think that's going to be a very rich dialogue. You will be able to participate. We're calling it a roundtable. So it's a forum where we've asked the panelists to respond to this information in the report, but to also talk a little bit about what they're doing in the community. And so I think that it's just going to be a fabulous conversation. I hope you join us. We also have Prevent Child Abuse New York on November 23rd, presenting on adverse childhood experiences and that study, but also from a prevention lens and how to prevent adverse childhood experiences and how the ACEs study can help us to make the case. On December 1st, I'll be presenting on strategies for engaging school nurses, and particularly with an eye for how to do that during COVID when so many schools really don't want us to be engaging. So it's, very much thinking about how do we engage people virtually, parents, administrators, school personnel. And then this is has a lot to do with what the very unique position that school nurses are in. And Jennifer, help me, did I get everything? It feels like there might be more.
Yeah. So that is pretty much everything. I did include in the chat box a link to the registration for Tuesday, as well as a link to all of the Prevention Summit workshops and descriptions. The only thing that I would add is after you close out this window, there is going to be a survey that pops up. If you could take just a few minutes to fill that out and let us know what your thoughts and what you'd like to hear more about. We really value your feedback.
Thank you. Thank you, Russ. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you to a captioner, Josh, and captioner, Andrew, who helped caption this webinar. The recording will be sent out. And if you can join us next Tuesday, gather your thoughts and come to this roundtable forum, ready to share what's happening in your community or what has happened, what you've learned with this group. So very exciting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Russ.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lorianne. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all. This was a wonderful conversation. I hope it had some meaning for you all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, folks.
Thank you all. Be well.